That's like.
Do that thing. Okay, so welcome to our session, Flourishing in the North of England. And I think we need to get straight into it. It's about a short amount of time. So a bit of background to what we are doing. I've been a second half of my life academic, in a sense. I did my doctorate I started my doctorate when I was 41, and I graduated when I was 48. And my project was on Englishness and contextual theology in England. And I've done some more work in the past. I worked in Stoke-on-Trent and in Tanzania before then. I've always been interested in place and context in relation to John's stuff as well. I wrote a book called The Faith of the English, and then I was interested in the context, which is the north of England. I was born and grew up in Hull, and still support the football team. Come on, you Tigers! And so when conversations began to be had about the re-evangelization of the North, they seem to ignore the question of the regional identity and culture of the North. So I wanted to do some work on that, and that resulted in this book. Moving on. We then did some more research. I was in conversation with Philip North, who's now the Bishop of Blackburn, and we got some funding. Elli joined me, and we did field research in the north of England around what constitutes a gospel in the north of England, and we wrote a little book about that. Okay, moving on.
I think that's me. So one of the first pieces of data we gathered in our research now leads us to further complexify this idea of flourishing. When we set out into our research journey into the question of faith and culture in the North, we needed to select some churches to study. We reckoned that if we were looking for a northern gospel, we needed to be looking in places where the gospel was taken seriously and being lived out in the lives of churches and communities, however that might look. So we contacted key people in the diocese, Anglican diocese of the Northern Province, and within the Methodist Church as well, in the north of England, and asked them to give us the names of some churches that we could research. And we initially invited them to tell us about the churches in their patch that they thought were flourishing in their local communities, because that related to our initial research question. But we quickly found out there was a real problem with this request over this word flourishing. We had used the word implicitly, we hadn't examined it at that point, but we'd used this word to indicate that we were looking for churches where something interesting was happening, where God was at work, where growth might be happening, where people might be discovering the gospel, however conceived, for the first time. But the various bishops, missioners, archdeacons and communications officers...
Methodist circuit.
Methodist circuit as well, yes, thank you. Methodist and Anglican.
Yeah.
Anybody higher up that we said, give us a flourishing church, names of some flourishing churches. They equated that word flourishing with successful. And the churches that they felt where something was happening, where good news was being expressed, people coming to faith, weren't successful. They identified those churches as being fragile, struggling on that knife edge between success and failure.
And just to go back to John's presentation, yeah, they were basically looking for, the money and the people, and they weren't there in that at that level to make the connection between the two presentation.
So just a reminder, as I think we're hearing there's a theme throughout this, flourishing does not look like success necessarily. Another critique of the idea of flourishing that we want to bring is simply that nothing in nature, we've had this idea of ecology, trees, images like that running through, nothing flourishes or flowers forever. If we use this metaphor of church as a living organism, we need to make room in our conceptual worlds for withering and death. If we over-prioritise the importance of flourishing, we miss what can be learned from decay and death. And Greg mentioned in his talk yesterday compost. And we wrote a surprising amount about compost in Fuzzy Church. Nigel's a better gardener than I am, but yeah, a lot about compost.
I love it. I love it. Worms.
The dying of one thing makes compost for another. In complex ecosystems, some organisms will need to die in order to create space for new ones to grow. Death of previously flourishing organisms is natural and necessary for new life to grow.
Okay. So the research goes on, and I've done some more work with the data that we collected since we published Fuzzy Church, because I'm trying to get a publisher for another book to go a bit deeper into the questions that were raised by the first one. And that's another story. Anyway, I came across Stephen Spencer's book, Growing and Flourishing, which I thought, well, you know, this conference is about flourishing, so that's why this paper is happening. So Stephen Spencer was an Anglican priest in Wakefield Diocese, which was officially linked through the Partnership for World Mission to Mara Diocese in Tanzania. He now works in the Anglican Communion Office in London and worldwide. He researched over several years rapid church growth in Tanzania, and he writes that up in this book with a local bishop, Rita Akiri. And I suppose if 1888, whoever it was tops in England, you know, this is looking at, you know, massive church growth in Tanzania in a similar way, I suppose, to what was happening here in the 19th century. Remarkable recent growth despite a significant lack of resources, drought and other trying circumstances. Over 25 years, Mara Diocese had grown by over 100-fold. That's from just 12 churches in 1985 to more than 140 in 2010, when the diocese was divided up. So he looks at that and uses a participant observation model on the companion link. He visits, does informal interviewing. It's not, I wouldn't describe it as a proper qualitative research project, but certainly there's elements of that in there. He develops 6 interconnected dimensions of that growth from the data that he collects from the Tanzanian church growth, and he relates that to Dulles' 6 models of the church in his classic text on ecclesiology. If you've done any ecclesiology, models of the church by Avery Dulles is one of the core texts. So I thought that was really helpful, and as I began to put those together and reflect on what he was reflecting on, I thought one of the ways that you might understand the church is in this ecological frame as a living organism. That's something that is, organic and alive. And that aliveness for us is about what happens across the boundary to the community and the context, to connect again with what John was saying, how the local church engages across its boundary with its community. And that's why fuzzy is important. We coined the word fuzzy from one of our interviewees, who described not quite knowing who was in and who was out, and the Magdalene community was a good example of that this morning, fuzziness at the boundary. So that led Spencer to a grid with 6 dimensions and 18 stages of church growth. So this is trying to complexify the question of how do you measure what's going on. Okay, so he's down the left-hand side are the 6 approaches to ecclesiology that are related to Dulles' models. You can see how they are: church as institution, church's servant, you know, they're all in there. And then he says he noticed in the data he collected from these Tanzanian churches that were just getting going, 3 stages of each of those aspects. And I really like this because it really helped me to think about flourishing church growth in a much more holistic and realistic way. So I also, of course, being a good academic, had a little critique of some of the things he talked about. So I changed a few of. I changed a few of them just because I didn't quite like some of the words he was using, and I tried to explain them a bit more. And what we then did in the chapter that might get published one day is we placed the data that we had 100,000 words of data from 7 churches in our qualitative research, and I kind of placed them on these stages just to see how that worked out and if it made sense. I changed some of that, like I said, that some of the stages a little bit, but we don't need to go into that now. But that's how it turned out. We had 7 churches across the north of England. 1 was Methodist, 2 were ecumenical, across different denominations, and the others were Anglican, and a variety of context, town, rural, city places. So we haven't got time to go into all that today. If you're interested, we can talk about it some more. What we wanted to do was to move to a description of one of these, just to help you to finish off with, about sacramental expression, because we kind of think that might be something that we don't always focus on in these kinds of contexts. So we thought we'd dig into that one so you could see an example of how the different stages operate within the church's sacrament mode. Back to Elli.
Thank you.
And you need that. Yeah.
I need that. Thank you. So these 3 stages of sacramental expression. First one is a spontaneous growth. Spencer here is drawing on this first millennium understanding of sacraments, that it includes a huge range of Christian experiences that hint at symbols or types in which the old order is seen as an anticipation of the faith, bringing a foretaste of God's salvation into bodily expression. The second stage of sacramentality is where there's intentionality. And we see, oh, hang on, I'll go back to that just so you've got the little, come on to that in a second. Second stage of sacramentality is where there's intentionality. And we see the sort of formal sacraments that we would recognise in a formal church expression. Spencer sees the intentionality as coming not only from those administering the sacraments, but also those receiving them. There is a collective understanding that these are formal sacraments. So that first stage of sacramentality can be described as spontaneous and irregular, coming from God as and when God chooses. In the second stage, expressed in the formal sacraments, those administering and receiving the sacraments play an instrumental part in what takes place by recalling Jesus's words, pouring water, laying hands on heads, breaking and eating bread and drinking wine. And the third stage is when a church is growing and flourishing into a holistic sacramental expression. Here, Spencer argues that there is a link between the whole life of a church, its community service as well as its worship and fellowship, and some kind of divine presence signified by the phrase, the true church. Somehow, he argues, this local church is embodying a qualitative difference from the other churches, a kind of anticipation of the new. And again, Greg mentioned yesterday this idea of institutions as sacraments, and that would marry very much with Spencer's third stage. Spencer argues you can't take it for granted, that when others see division and selfishness in congregational life, they very quickly stop seeing this as something sacramental, as the true church. And we categorised the churches where we conducted our fieldwork mainly in stage 2, with a couple in stage 3. Although Church D was primarily in that intentional second stage of sacramentality, an example of this first stage of spontaneous sacramentality can be seen here. This is Church D, an Anglican church on the social housing estates of a few thousand people in Lancashire. One of the church leaders described how when people first come to the church, they might just sit, and often just sit weeping if it's the first few weeks when they come in. And it's that love of God that is often a physical feeling that they're having and an emotional encounter. So that's an example of that spontaneous embodied sacramentality that Spencer argues for. An example of the intentional stage of sacramentality, I'm going to give you an example from Church C. Church C had majored on baptism. This was a new worshipping community in Yorkshire, made up mainly of homeless, addicted and very vulnerable people. They'd majored on baptism since its inception. The leader told us they inhabit this sacrament and have performed at least 160 baptisms, mainly by full immersion in a pool which was physically present in the worship space. What they had struggled with was the institution of Holy Communion. And when we visited, we witnessed an experiment on how they might conduct Holy Communion in a way that was sacramentally meaningful in this group. Stage 3 of this dimension is where the presence and activity of God in the life of a local church is noticed by those outside it, this holistic sense. We didn't do a huge amount of data gathering from people outside the church, but here is a leader from Church B noting that they had heard a local authority councillor saying the town would be in a mess if it wasn't for you Christians. And a quote from a leader in Church E, where the Eucharist and baptism, especially of Iranian asylum seekers, was a really important point. The leader said, when we did the big local service back in 2014, I think, when people were asked where is the heart of the community, they said the name of that church's community centre. So it was recognised as being important from outside the church. But going back full circle to our earlier critique of flourishing, when I was talking to the bishop responsible for this area of Yorkshire, and I said, oh, there's Church E, that's a really exciting one. Is that flourishing? You know, is that somewhere you think we could visit? I was told, John's research coming in here, their parish share, what they paid to the diocese, was very low, and therefore the bishop wouldn't count it as flourishing. And it makes us wonder, what's the thinking behind these comments from bishops, archdeacons, district and circuit leaders? Presumably, just as we do in this conference, they would all sign up for the need for flourishing churches in their espoused and possibly even formal theology. But when pushed, did they maybe sense that actually this isn't possible? Flourishing isn't always possible. In an acknowledged operant theology. How can leaders be really honest about what is going on? And this is a salient reminder that the term flourishing can be so misunderstood and used in different ways. And so we're arguing that Spencer's work in Mara and his 3 stages of flourishing and growth can give us a framework to analyse this much more articulately. And there's just descriptions of the churches where we researched.